Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our tech session. I'm Bill Heller, your moderator. Today, our presenter will take you through an introduction to web development, including HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and tooling. Brandon Stryker is a multifaceted software engineer and educator, experienced in both network programmability and full-stack development. With certifications like AWS Solutions Architect and PSM, he has steered multiple projects from data visualization for the Census Bureau to Web3 blockchain integrations. Pursuing a master's in software engineering, Brandon is passionate about fostering understanding and always seeks to elevate the skills of his peers and students.
Do we see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. So like I said, we're going to be looking at the web development fundamentals, an overview of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript roles, so how they interact with each other and come together to create a web page. And then we'll go into a little more detail on HTML page structure, so some of the core HTML elements like body and divs and tags that can contain text and stuff like that. CSS styling, in order to apply visually appealing or graphical layers on top of our structure, and then JavaScript for dynamic behavior. We're not going to get too deep into JavaScript because it is an entire programming language and you can't possibly learn it in 30 minutes, but we'll discuss how it interacts with HTML and CSS elements and styling and how it would be incorporated into the website and what we can do with it. And then we'll talk about some development tools that we can use to investigate what's going on our site and view things like the console and network traffic to help debug or possibly reverse engineer some other existing applications or applications that exist within our organization and so on. And then we'll have some closing wrap-up questions and recap resources for the learning. All right, let's get started. So, of course, the fundamentals of web development include HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is going to be true regardless of what you're doing, really. Even if you're using some Python framework to create a website like Django, or if you're using Node, or a variety of other options. And in the modern world, we have a lot of options of how we can actually create web-based applications, but regardless of what framework we're using, usually it's going to boil down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we'll see that, a knowledge of these three technologies is still important for pretty much any form of web development. So, web development stands on three pillars. We have HTML, which provides page structure, CSS for styling, and JavaScript for behavior. If you only want to contain information on your page, you can just use HTML. If there's absolutely no styling necessary and you don't care what color anything is or how things are aligned and organized, HTML is fine. If you want there to be some style, some sort of visually appealing display of this information, then we want to apply CSS. And if you want anything dynamic to occur, meaning I move my mouse and something happens, or if I click somewhere, something happens, or if I scroll, something happens, we're going to need to use JavaScript. And we can imagine these in terms of a building. HTML, the structure, would be like the foundation poured with concrete and the framing done with 2x4s and 2x6s. And now we have a general scaffolding for something. And then CSS, the style, would be like the paint and the trim and maybe the specific flooring we choose and the material for our roof, whatever that makes our house look pretty. And then JavaScript would equate to the plumbing and electric that is run through the house that provides some sort of dynamic functionality. I pull this switch and, pull switches. I press this switch and a light goes on. I open this faucet and water comes out and it goes away, right? So these are comparable to the way these technologies operate within a web page. First, let's take a look at some basic HTML. Here, Generally, we will start our HTML with a doc type. And that is just declaring that we are using HTML in this document. And we could specify which version and some other things here. But when you see doc type HTML at the top of a page, you know that's an HTML document. Next, you have an HTML tag where we could declare the language. And then we have our head, body, and we see closing tags for each of these as well. So HTML starts here, and we see at the very end, we have a closing tag. So HTML always consists of an open tag and a closing tag. Sometimes you can have a self-closing tag, and that's not so common, and certain IDEs and frameworks don't really like you to do that, even if the tag has no data. But we see the meta tag doesn't actually even have any kind of slash at the end indicating it's closing. So certain tags behave a little differently, but for the most part, we're going to be having an open tag and a closing tag for every HTML element. And most of our content is going to go in the body tag. Okay, the head, so here we see title. This is like what you would see in the tab, right, in your web browser. The tab has words. There are other things you can put in the head section, like metadata, stuff for search engine optimization, tags that would direct web browsers or search engines to your site based on classification of what content you have. You can also link external resources here and run JavaScript, which we'll talk about a little later. But generally, this section is for metadata or things that are not going to be directly displayed in your page. The body notably contains header, footer, and everything in between that is generally considered the content of your page. Now, you can break from this, these elements. You don't need to put the header inside the header tag. We'll find that divs are containers, and they could be any shape, any size, and you can position them anywhere on the page. That will take CSS in order to accomplish what I just claimed is possible. But the same is true for the header and the footer. If we want these things to look a certain way or have a certain behavior with regard to where they are on the page and how wide they are and what the font and organization of the information inside of them is, we're going to need to apply CSS regardless. So, div and P tag meaning paragraph, which contains text. These are by far the two most common and probably most important elements that we're going to see in use in web development. And you can actually create a pretty robust web page just using these two things, just divs and P tags, because that is just containers for information, and you can change the shape, the background color, the corners, the positioning, everything about this container. And the same is true for a P tag. It just contains text. I can then apply styling to that to make the text a header or a subtext or some information that's supposed to go in the footer, right? So we'll see how we would do that with CSS in a little bit. But really, these are the two most important tags that you're going to ever encounter. And we'll see them in use very frequently. So here's a little example or how this HTML text that we were just viewing would map to an actual website. So we see here the title, Learning HTML, is in the tab, like I mentioned. You can also customize, you see this little globe, this little world icon. That would be your fav icon, Favicon, and you can specify that as well and have a different little image here. Okay, but other than those two things, not much that's in the head section is going to be visible to the user. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, you might apply CSS styling in this section. You might incorporate JavaScript code that you've written into this section, but these things are set up for the page. The body contains the actual content. And we see H1 Welcome, H1 is another text tag. Okay, but it's becoming more common, as I've seen, that you don't really need to use the H1 tag because probably you're not going to want to use the basic styling that goes along with it. So you're going to end up styling it. And if you're styling text, well, now it doesn't actually matter if you've used an H1 tag or a P tag. What's going to matter is the way you're applying that CSS styling to that element. Okay, so again, we'll take a look at that when we get to the CSS section, but you can apply the same styling to either of these tags. And that's why I said generally P tags are the most common at this point, unless maybe you're linking to another site, in which case you would use maybe an A tag, which is stands for anchor. And that is generally how you'll see links. But again, with CSS and JavaScript, you can turn a P tag into a link, right? It just depends on the styling that you apply to that element. So we see the P tag in its default styling here. Let's learn about web development. Okay, so just without any CSS styling applied, we see the H1 tag is big and a little more bold, or it looks bold. Maybe that's just because it's big. And we see the P tag is a little smaller. Cool. Now, here are some other tags that you would want to know about. We have first H2, and you have H1 through H6, just so you know. And these all have their default size, and their font's going to be the same, and the font weight is going to be the same. Text decoration, whatever it is, right? I don't think it's bold, but whatever text decoration applies to H1, it should be consistent through H6. But again, you can create your own custom classes, and we'll talk about that later. P tags, again, this is just some information, textual information that we want to display on the page. We have an A tag, like I mentioned. A tags will consist of an href, and that should be the site you're linking to, or the external resource, or whatever link you want to people to follow when they click on the contents of the tag, which are click here. Okay, and we see on the page the default styling of an A tag. It's blue and underlined, and after you click it, generally it'll turn purple. These things might be configurable in your web browser, if you have styling set up or some sort of appearance settings. Then we have an unordered list. There are two types of lists that are fundamental within HTML. That's an unordered list or an ordered list. So that's UL or OL. And they are each going to consist of LI tags, list item. And we see list item 1, 2, and 3. The difference between an unordered list and an ordered list is unordered lists are bulleted and ordered lists are numbered. Then we have another pretty useful tag that you're going to also see a fair amount, image. Okay, and that is going to have a source and an alt, meaning if the image couldn't load for whatever reason, it should show this if you hover the broken image icon. And then a button. These are also pretty popular. But like I said, you can create a button with a div. You can create an image with a div, right? You could set the background of a div to be, this image. But generally, if you're displaying an image, you want to use an image tag. And this just helps for clarity. Because though what I said is possible, it will be confusing for someone reading the page if every single thing is a div. And we'll see how we apply custom styling and how we can name styles. So that would clear it up a little bit, but it's better practice to use the element that's more aligned with the actual content or the thing you're trying to display. So this is a very basic HTML page that showcases some of the fundamental elements that we would want to use on a page, and here's what it equates to. This is what the page would look like in a web browser. Okay, before we go any further, I'll just say, in order to view an HTML page that you've created in a web browser, all you need to do is, well, you should be able to double click the file on your computer. If you have something called index.html, you should be able to double click it and view that in a web browser. The only alternative would be if you've invested heavily into web development and you decided all HTML files should be opened in a program that you use to edit them, like VS Code or some other text editor. In that case, you would just right-click it and say open with my preferred web browser. Okay, let's take a look at how CSS styling looks and what it would do to that same web page. So there are a few different ways we can apply CSS styling. But regardless, the goal is to enhance the visual presentation of web pages. And that means apply styling, right? Change the font, change the positioning, change something visual about these things, something like text alignment or padding. We'll talk about padding in a bit. So what we see here is body, header, div, footer. These are pre-declared, right? These are pre-existing HTML elements. So all I have to do to apply styling throughout the entire HTML document that we're using this CSS within, all I need to do is mention that HTML element by name, and then we have our open curly braces, and there are a lot of styling options, but the ones you most likely are going to want to know about are the things that you would be applying sooner rather than later. Margin and padding. These affect how an item is situated with regard to the page or other elements that are nearby or within the div or container that this thing exists in. Okay, so here we're saying that every div that we create is going to have a padding of 20 pixels. And the margin is going to be 20 pixels on the upper side and lower side, and 0 pixels on the left and right. So there are a few different ways you can handle this. If I just say 20px, that means apply padding of 20 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left of a thing. Or if I do this, I'm applying 20 pixels to the y-axis and 0 to the x-axis. Alternatively, I can actually specify margin 0001. So I could specify the exact padding for every side of an element. And I'm just using pixels here, but you can actually use a variety of other measurements as well, such as VW, which is visual width, VH, visual height. You can use percentages, which get a little tricky because now you need to be aware of where this thing is, right? If I say 70%, it's going to be 70%, like let's say the height should be 70% of a given thing. Well, if that thing exists within another thing that has a static size, now it's only going to be 70% of the container that it's in. It's not going to be 70% of the whole page. So percentages get a little more tricky because you need to be aware of these things. Either way, all of the examples we see here, body, header, div, and footer, these are stylings that are being applied to existing HTML tags, and we're just saying within this document, the body should consist of these styled attributes. The header should have these styling attributes. Every div should be this way, and the footer should be this way. So now we remember this. Well, this is the full. We just saw this snippet earlier, but this is the full HTML document that creates this web page. So if I were to take this CSS styling and apply it to this HTML document using the link tag, and this is how we generally, without the use of a framework or any other technology, this is how we're going to apply styling to our HTML. we have the link, rel equals style sheet, and then the href is the path to that style sheet. So what we see here is the file style.css would be in the same directory as this HTML document. Alternatively, you can apply external styling. If your computer has internet access, this document can actually be hosted on a server somewhere, and then there's, of course, access that would need to be, the whatever's running this would need to have permission and access to that external resource, but we can actually load styling from somewhere else. It doesn't even have to be on this computer that we're working on. But now when I import this style.css document to be used here, we see body, we see a header, we see a div, we see the footer. So the styling that we've declared here is going to be applied, and it will make the page look more like this, which is much nicer than what we saw previously. And this is a fairly simple, right? This is a fairly simple CSS. We're just saying, make these things have colors and apply padding. Oops, sorry. Apply padding, meaning 20 pixels on each side. And we'll see what that looks like and how we can inspect that when we get to the web development tools. So, what are some other ways we can apply CSS styling within a document of that nature? We saw the basic styling for HTML elements that already exist. We can also style nested elements. So any p tag within a div should have the margin left attribute set to 20 pixels. Okay, margin and padding, again, just add space to some side of an element, either relative to the container or to itself. So we'll see a little bit more about that in the future. But this is useful for, if we had p tags within list items, right? And we, instead of the list item just being text itself, like we saw earlier, it was list item 1, list item 2. If instead we wanted the list item to be, a p tag, and we want those to look a certain way, and that should be different from p tags in other places in this HTML document, well, now we can apply specific selective styling based on where tags are located with regard to other tags. This third one, custom class, is by far the most granular and I'm going to say best practice, because it gives you the option to not worry if someone puts a p tag in a div somewhere else, because that doesn't matter. Instead, what I'm going to say is, I'll name this something that applies to why it's important that p tags within a div are styled this way, right? So maybe they're body items or, part of a list of things, and I would just name it cool list item, right? And now, instead of worrying about the structure, all I need to do is apply the class name cool list item to the HTML elements that should be styled in this way, with a padding of 10px on each side and a background color of grayish. Okay, another thing we could do is, this is just mentioning hover effects, but there are a variety of things you can use here, different states that an element can be in. So you can hover it, or maybe you can have already clicked it or highlight it, right? There are a variety of things, and we'll take a look at some of those options also when we get to the web development tools. But here, what I'm saying is any anchor tag, which is, again, generally a link to an external resource or another website or another page within our site, any anchor tag, when you move your cursor on top of it, like I am to this FF0000, make its color red. And then if I move my cursor away, it'll go back to being blue. Move back, it's red again. Right? So this is a slightly dynamic behavior, but not really. right? It's making something change based on what I'm doing, but it's very static, it's very simple, and it really only applies to the styling. So we'll see how later with JavaScript, I can make it so that if I hover this one, well, I'm using this as an example for an anchor tag or a link, but if I were to hover this, I can make the whole page content change, right? I have a lot more power with JavaScript to interact with every element on the page instead of just the anchor tag that I'm hovering over. Okay, so that's the difference between CSS styling or applying styling with JavaScript, because I can now reach out beyond this one thing that I'm describing here and make something happen globally on this page. And the last thing we'll talk about, this is a little more complex and you probably won't get to this kind of thing for a while, but you have, what are they called? At rules. Sorry. So this is a rule, an HTML rule, and there are a variety of at rules that have certain behavior, and these are introduced in more recent, more modern versions of HTML and CSS. CSS. But what this is doing is saying if the max width of the site or the browser window is 600 pixels, then apply this styling. So this is, again, a little bit more dynamic than what CSS1 was capable of. But now we can apply styling based on the size of the viewport or the screen or the window or however we want to specify that things should be styled differently based on how big it is. So what does this do? Like we say here, on a small screen, this is very small, actually, the background color would be a darker gray. The background color of the body. And we can specify other things here as well. So, we can set different attributes for divs and p and everything. We can make everything smaller if the screen is small, if we think that will make it look nicer. All right, that's our intro to CSS, and let's take a look at how JavaScript would fit into this equation now. Here's a pretty important, there's a few little important things here. First, document. All right, I'm looking at this code sample above the browser window that we see. Document is the JavaScript object that refers to the entire page that we're viewing. Okay, so this is going to have pretty much everything that we can view or could view, right? So the things we can see now, things that are hidden, things that might exist in the background based on something that happens on the page or whatever might be around, right? Pretty much any functionality, any style, any elements that exist can be accessed through document. There's another one that has very similar functionality called window. These are two of the most common or most important JavaScript objects to know about. And what we're doing here is we're adding an event listener. And these will have either specific names or we can name them ourselves and apply them to a certain element like a button and say if someone clicks that button, do something. So again, we're not going too deep into JavaScript, but this function here, which doesn't have a name, right? It's just a function that we're running. Sorry, that's called a callback function. Okay, a callback function is a very important concept in JavaScript because we cannot always control the order of things that will occur in the JavaScript on a web page. I don't know who's going to click what when. I don't know what, I can't say exactly what's going to happen always on a given site. So instead, JavaScript has something called callback functions. So here, the event listener is saying once the DOM content loaded, the DOM is another important concept. This is the document object model. And this is essentially the representation of everything on our web page. Okay, the DOM, I recommend doing some research into that after this lesson or course. But this is a very important concept, not for how you write your code, not for how you write CSS or HTML or anything like that, but it's important to understand and have a general idea of what its purpose is and how the DOM is created for vanilla JavaScript, which is what we're looking at here, which is just pure JavaScript with HTML and CSS, no frameworks, no additional code being used. So a callback function runs once something is done, right? And that might be the DOM content loaded, and we have interpreted all of the content of the HTML documents and the CSS documents, and we're ready to display a web page. Now we would run this JavaScript function alert. And in the parentheses, we have what we want the alert to say. And we actually see that here we say this page says, that is the default content of an alert, and then our specific message that we want the user to know, welcome to the site. Okay, alternatively, a callback function might be used for an asynchronous API request. If our page is making a request to an external resource, like a REST API, or maybe to another service, a web handle, a webhook that interacts with a database or something, anything that might take some time, generally, we're going to want to handle that asynchronously. Asynchronous means I'm going to make my request, and then I'm going to go about my business. I'm not going to sit here and wait to get that data back before going about whatever else I have to do. I am JavaScript in this scenario. As opposed to synchronous, which is I make the request, and that response that I'll get back eventually has important data, and I actually can't do anything else until I have that data. Well, then we'll wait until we get that response and then do something. Okay? Either way, an API request would most likely utilize a callback function, because whether the rest of the site is going to continue loading or operating or not, we still probably want to do something when we get that response, right? The same way here, we want to do something when the page loads. Okay, so this is a useful application of add event listener, and I'll show you another one in a little bit. How do we actually apply JavaScript to the HTML and CSS that we've already discussed? Well, good news, CSS is CSS, and it is not actually the structure, and it is not going to be interacting with the JavaScript at all. JavaScript can interact with CSS, but CSS doesn't interact with JavaScript, meaning I can use JavaScript to change the style of elements, but the reverse, there's no logical way for CSS to do anything to JavaScript, right? It's just a document that has styled attributes. In the body or the head is where we're going to want to include either the script tag, which can actually just contain JavaScript in and of itself. Here we see console.log hello world. If we're using the script tag in the body, it should go after all the content. And there should be, my apologies, but there should be a closing tag for the body here. So the script tag should be the last thing within the body. Or it can be in the head. Meaning we either want to run this thing before we've interpreted the actual content of the page, or after we've interpreted everything and we see, we've already considered all the elements that'll exist and whether or not the styling is there and how we should style these things. Okay, console.log is really super important for development. This is how we would be able to view the value of anything that we're interacting with via JavaScript. And if you've never dabbled into web development before, you may not have ever opened this developer tools page, or you've never viewed the JavaScript console in your web browser, but this is where the data is going to be written to. When I say console.log, what I'm saying is print to this JavaScript console. In this case, just hello world. But that, that kind of thing might be useful if we're doing development and we want to say, trying to do this now. I did that, it didn't work, something like that. Or I did that, I got the response, here's what it looks like. And now I can visually inspect that and see if it looks valuable or useful or like what I expected. But generally, you are probably going to use this to just do that second thing I mentioned, right? Inspect things and see, because there's no other way I can view the value of a variable that is being defined in some way other than just x equals 4, right? If I say x equals 4, I know x equals 4. If I say response equals code that makes an API request, I can't know what came back without inspecting it. And this is how I would do it. Okay, so console.log, big friend for development. Now, this is the script tag, is used, but more commonly, instead, we're going to see something like console.log put in a file called index.js. And these files, you can have a directory called JavaScript, and you could have 20 different JS files, and those can be applied or imported based on what HTML page they are intended to be used in. Okay, but when we are using JavaScript that's written in a separate file, we're going to use the script tag still, but we're going to specify the source as the either local path, right? So this is index.js, or we could do /index.js, meaning within the same directory as this HTML document. And we're saying run this. So now, within the JavaScript file, if we don't want everything to just run all at once, then we need to make sure that the JavaScript has logic implemented and conditions and instructions basically on when, what should run, and how. Okay, that is another lesson. We'll get to that another day. But for now, just knowing how you can apply your JavaScript from a file in your HTML, this is what we're talking about, right? How these things interact. So here we're loading the JavaScript code from here, and this will have the same exact functionality, the same behavior as the last example we saw. But it is much more common that you want to selectively apply certain JavaScript in certain HTML files or pages. And other than that, it really helps for organization. Decoupling your JavaScript from your HTML, meaning keeping these documents separate and applying them with something like this, it makes the actual development process and managing your project's files and resources a lot easier, because the organization is a lot easier to understand and keep track of. So here is an example of how we can actually interact with document within the JavaScript console. Yes, you can actually go just write JavaScript on any given web page and change whatever you want about it, as long as whoever wrote the web page didn't specifically make that impossible for you. And you'll see, hopefully you'll investigate some web pages and try to look at what's going on there after you understand how things are organized and where you might find what. But you'll see that oftentimes nowadays, because of frameworks, code is obfuscated, meaning what I see in elements or what I see in the console isn't going to be easy for me to understand. And the reason is, companies don't want you to steal their thing that they spent a lot of money creating, unless they're open source. And even then, it might just be better for them not to expose all this information. However, sometimes you can just inspect things, especially when you're the one creating it. So here, all I'm doing is I type document and I hit enter. And I see the output is document. What does that look like? Well, the text is just the HTML, right? The HTML is what we see here is the same as what I would see if I clicked elements. Okay, this is a little bit of an easier way to actually view and interact with the page content, and we'll see why in a little bit. But here I can see the HTML, but within JavaScript, document can actually be interacted with, and we could do a lot more than just see what's there. So here on the next line, I said document.body. So that means this section, right? The body within the document. And I'm going to interact with its style attribute, which will have a ton of options of what we can stylize and customize. And then I'm interacting with the background color. And I've set it with an equal sign, I've set it to be cyan. And when I hit enter, the console just spits cyan back out at me, but I see the web page body change color. Okay. So this is one way we can apply styling or interact with CSS via JavaScript. And there are other ways, of course, but this is a simple way that we can interact with the style of something within our HTML document. Here, I've created a button, and the button says click me. Okay, but the important thing here is the ID. I am identifying this button. I'm giving it a name. It's called my button. And now I can use JavaScript to select and manipulate things based on that ID. Okay, so let's take a look at how that would look. I know this is complicated, but we'll break it down in a simple way. First, another extremely important concept is get element. If you want to interact with any HTML element within JavaScript, you will need to get access to it. So we either get element by tag, or we can get element by ID, or we can get elements pluralized by class, right? So maybe the CSS class. There are a few different ways that you can decide what you want to interact with. And the difference between singular versus plural will dictate whether this is just one HTML element or maybe an array or a list of HTML elements. But what I'm doing here is I'm just saying this variable, my button, should be that button, that HTML item that I've created. And now I can use methods to specify. I can add an event listener, the same thing we were looking at earlier that was waiting to see if the web page loaded. Now I can set this to exist. Add event listener, click. So this is now just running on the web page. It's always running. Once the page loads, my button is waiting to be clicked. And when someone clicks it, this function will run. Okay, and this function, again, does not have a name, doesn't take any arguments. It's just a callback function, meaning it'll run when something happens. And we have our open curly brace and close curly brace right here. So everything between this and this is the function. What's going on here? Well, I'll try to explain it simply. This is just a list of colors. Okay, these are hex colors. And is this the best way to describe colors in your document? No, I have no idea. Just looking at these, I have no idea what colors these are, right? I assume they are all pastel colors. In this context, is it important that I know which colors these are? No, because the next line randomizes which one we're using. Okay, so don't worry about this. It's just pick a random number, multiply the random number by the number of items available and round it down. But basically we're saying the random color we're choosing will be one of these pastel colors. Okay, so don't worry too much about the specifics there. But the idea is we're creating randomization. We've now created a variable that's going to hold the value of one of these things. And then we're going to apply that, right? The same way we did before when you saw that I said the document body style background color should be cyan. Now it's going to be whatever value this variable ended up holding. Okay? So what's the point of this button? I click it, it picks a random color out of these 5, and it makes the background of the web page that random color. Okay, the last JavaScript we're really going to look at is set timeout, and this is another useful thing to know about. It is going to wait for some amount of time. So here's set timeout. This is another since ES6, which is the most recent version of JavaScript, this is another way you can create or write a callback function. Instead of function, open parentheses, curly bracket, function code, close curly bracket. Instead, and this is actually what I did up here too, just so we're clear, you should pick one and use the one all the time. I use 2 here, 2 different approaches to creating a callback function because I want to show you each of them. But you should be consistent within your JavaScript. So here I'm saying, wait some amount of time. The amount of time you wait is the second argument, 100. Okay, the first argument being this whole function. The function is just saying what to do. What's it going to do? It's going to open one of those nice little boxes that pop up, and it's going to say, I changed the color to whatever it picked. Again, when it outputs this, I still won't, the only reason I'll know what it did is because the whole web page color should change. This isn't very clear. No one that I know has memorized, hex code colors, except for maybe black and white, which are like 0000000 and FFFFFF. But that's fine. Again, this is just to show you that after 100 milliseconds, well, I click the button, it changes the color of the background. Then, after it changes the color, 100 milliseconds later, or 1/10 of a second, we'll see this alert pop up and tell us what just happened. Okay? So now that this is described in our document called, called index.js, when I apply this in index.html, nothing's going to run, but it will be prepared, right? So now the button I click, whenever I click it, knows what to do when it's clicked, and it'll do this. And that will look like this. Click the button. I change the background color to this. Okay, so this is one simple example of how we can apply JavaScript to HTML and interact with CSS. Okay, so that's how these 3 things fit together. Though I'm moving a little quicker now because we're a little short on time, but let's talk about the development tools. And the most important, I don't know if it's the most important. It's pretty important. I guess you could technically write this stuff in any text editor. However, an integrated development environment, or IDE, is going to be a good friend of yours. This one is VS Code, Visual Studio Code, and I can install extensions. That's what this little 3 blocks with another block either coming or going, whatever it's doing. I can now download things that are designed to help me in web development, maybe HTML specific, maybe CSS specific, maybe JavaScript specific. Alternatively, I don't know if any of you use VS Code or if you know what this is, but this is a GitHub Copilot text chat. So I can actually pop that open and ask this AI model how to do something. It can't specifically read my code or create, but I can copy stuff and paste it and say, why isn't this working? So that's pretty useful too. So usually IDEs will have the ability to add extensions or plugins that can facilitate your development, and colorization, and Explorer will have your package organization and documents that are included, and this is a big improvement on something like text editor. The next important thing is our browser developer tools. So here we can inspect things like the elements, and this is, as I described earlier, it is going to consist of the same thing that is in our index.html, which is the same thing that if I went to the console and typed document and hit enter, I would see this outputted. Okay, there might be some tiny differences in each place, but generally we'll see the same content. Maybe just different functionality. Because you see here I've selected footer, and on the right we see the CSS styling described. Okay, and then here, Hov, what does that mean? I'll show you in a sec. We'll get to that, and I'll show you some of the cool things we could do with that. Alternatively, we have the console. I mentioned window earlier. Window has a lot of the same usages as document. However, it is more overarching. This will contain everything in the window, including document, right? So document exists within the window, but so does, the size of the actual application window and other stuff outside of just this page that we're looking at, more high level. It's good to know some of the important things that we'll see in window and in document. But these are definitely these are the first two things I would go look at, because understanding what is in window and what is in document, these are going to open some pathways for you to go investigate some other things in JavaScript functionality and so on. I can also check out network activity. This page is very simple. So all that's happening is we see in the waterfall model, things are being loaded, right? However, if this page were more complex and another JavaScript file was loaded and that JavaScript file makes an API request to a thing that's going to serve up data from a database, I would see that API request took 600 milliseconds or however long, and then once that got back, which processes ran and how long they took and so on. And you can actually inspect some of the specifics about things like that within this network monitor. So before we move on to the final section, I'm just going to show you, I have this page open already. Where is it? Here we go. And here we can actually see the functionality that I was mentioning earlier. But some other things we can do. I mentioned Hov. I can force an element state. Okay, so if I wanted to, well, there's really nothing here that's going to react to that, fortunately. But let's say I was trying to test hover on this, right? I would select my P tag that I want to focus on, and I would click hover. And I mean, this is still useful. I see that if I hover this, nothing changes. Okay. I can also, in this same elements viewer, I can go to P tag and I can create a new, add something. Hold on. I can add styling here. Usually. I don't know why it's giving me trouble. Okay, another cool thing you can do is right-click on anything on the web page and click Inspect. And this will be a little different between web browsers, but this general functionality should exist. And what it's going to do is open this Elements page and focus on that thing initially. Okay, so this is a good way to quickly target something and see some information about it, like this image. It's coming from here, and these are the CSS styling options. I don't know why it's not letting me add custom styling. Never had an issue with that before. It's not really something I need to do too often, though. Well, anyway, generally you should apply your styling in your code and then reload it, because whatever I do here, if I could do something here, there we go. I could say something like cursor pointer. And now that I've declared that, when I move my mouse over this, I see it is a hand instead of this little text highlighter cursor, right? And now that I've put that there, I can apply it or unapply it, right? There are a few different ways to interact with the site through this nice little elements page. And in addition to that, another important thing is if I'm inspecting this image, I can check the margin, meaning how this thing is situated regarding the container that it's in, the border, which if I wanted, like this has a border, right? This button has a border. I know that because there is a line drawn around it. And then I can see the padding, which is now the content, right? So margin for button is the same as padding for whatever the button is in, as long as it's the only thing in that container. So margin is outside, then you have border, then padding, and then internal content. Okay, but you can use this same page here, this same section of the console and developer tools to actually inspect things like this and test applying different styling and different states to your HTML and see what they look like. Okay, in addition, I mentioned the console. You can write JavaScript code here or inspect things that already exist and try to figure out something about them or interact with them or test code. You can also view back in Elements event listeners, right? So you can see all the things that we're creating, whether it's HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. We can interact with most of these things through the developer tooling. So I believe that is enough in the way of words, because there have been many words. And I'm sure it's a lot to wrap your head around, and the path forward from here would be probably to read some documentation. I believe, Bill, you had some follow-up questions and...
Yeah, sure do. Thanks, Brandon.
Hit me. Yep.
So yeah, for the Q&A portion of the presentation, we do have a couple questions that came in. The first is, where should I go to learn JavaScript?
Wonderful. So there are a variety of resources available online. JavaScript is currently maintained by the Mozilla organization. So that's a great place. Their documentation is extensive, and they explain pretty much everything you would want to know about JavaScript. JavaScript being the more complex topic here to wrap your head around, it being an entire programming language. Outside of that, W3 Schools is an excellent place to find out information about HTML and CSS. elements and attributes, respectively. And then for an intro to JavaScript, I don't think we'll be able to fit it into an Athena session. If we could, I would recommend that. However, I've had good experiences with the Code Academy course on JavaScript, and it's pretty good. But really, the Mozilla documentation and getting your hands dirty would probably be your best bet, because then you really start to play around with it and start to think about how you can use these things. And of course, the Mozilla docs will include, small projects or things, code samples for you to run and try and play around with.
Perfect. The other question is, what are some libraries I should look into for connecting my site to external resources?
It's another great question. So within JavaScript, and that is how you would want to make any kind of request, either to an internal or external resource. Within JavaScript, there is a library called Fetch. However, there are better ways. Some things you should look into include Ajax and XHR. And both of these can be used to make requests, but Ajax actually has additional functionality, such as something called syntax candy, syntax sugar. So instead of writing some code like what I had, like document.getElementById, open parentheses, something, you can actually just type a $, open parentheses, and then the name of a thing. So Ajax is another good thing to look into once you have some grasp on JavaScript. And it's a very useful tool that incorporates with your vanilla JavaScript development. And then beyond that, well, the world opens many doors beyond that, because then you start incorporating frameworks such as Node. Node has thousands of libraries. Plenty of them can be used to make an API request. So beyond vanilla JavaScript, there are a lot of options, but I recommend probably Ajax is the right place to start looking for more information, because of not only its ability to make these API requests, but also to more easily interact with your existing web page.
Perfect. Well, I believe that does it for our Q&A. So I do want to thank our presenter, Brandon, as well as thank everyone that joined today's session. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation and have a wonderful day.
Happy coding, everyone.